So I'll just begin by saying that as those of us who are in Toronto are on the lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and Wendat peoples. This land that we are on is also the home of many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. The city we acknowledge that Toronto is covered under the Treaty 13, which is signed by the Mississaugas of the Credit and is also an element with the Dish with One Spoon treaty. And we know that Turtle Island has a sordid and challenging history for those of us who come to it either formally as settlers or for folks of my particular descent via the transatlantic slavery. So whether we've migrated here by choice or force, or whether our history goes to the 11 to 1200,000 years that this land exists, it is a complicated one. And in these times, we're particularly conscious of the need to acknowledge that we have a responsibility to be better allies with those who are the keepers of this land. With that said, I'm gonna turn it over to Howard and then sit back and enjoy this conversation I'm looking forward to. Thanks again.
Thank you, Karen. And thanks as well to the EyeCity team, as well as all the organizers of YIMBY. It's really actually great to be here and actually have this conversation today. Today is actually, I mean, it is a cloudy, dreary day here in Toronto, which actually is quite nice for having a really good, cozy conversation, I would say, to talk about some really, I would say, really like deep issues about what it means to look at the city, urbanism, what it means to talk about urban futures and who gets included in those futures, and how do we actually acknowledge also the past. So I think that we're in for a really great talk today, and I'm really excited that Lena, Sibonelo, and Tareq are here to share their perspectives on this. So I'll just give a really quick introduction, but then I'll let them also introduce themselves more formally. But Lena, Sibonelo, and Tareq are each spatial and creative practitioners with shared interests in exploring decolonial and just urban futures. They are particularly interested in operating outside of limiting imaginaries that often suppress the spatial practices, knowledge systems, and aesthetics of Black, Indigenous, and racialized people. And as you'll see in their presentation, they really do challenge a lot of how we see space, place, and urbanism. So thank you to our wonderful panelists today for offering their time to be with us to talk about these important issues. And without further ado, I do actually want to hand it over to Lena, who, again, please introduce yourself and tell us what you want to tell us today.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Howard and Karen, and everyone who was part of the team in making this happen and for inviting us to be here. And yeah, thanks to Karen for starting us off with the land acknowledgement. So as might be clear, we're not joining from Turtle Island or from Sakaranto. So today I am joining you from a small town on South Africa's western Cape Coast, a little bit north of Cape Town, on the traditional Indigenous territories of the Khoisan peoples. And like Canada, this part of the world is still deeply bound by settler colonial logics. And so as someone who is a guest on these territories as well, I'm consistently negotiating my relationship to this land, which means actively seeking ways to honor and support the actualization of Black and Indigenous self-determination. Next slide, please. And increasingly, and echoing the sentiments expressed by many Indigenous peoples about the somewhat performative nature of land acknowledgements, without the concrete commitments to land back, these statements lack accountability. So I definitely encourage folks to engage the work of Indigenous organizations, activists, leaders, and artists who have very clearly articulated the ways in which to actualize land back on Turtle Island. And also this conversation of land back is also situated in a broader global conversation of displacement and dispossession through continued settler and neo-colonialism. So as folks, the three of us engaging in conversation today, coming from three different settler colonial societies. This transnational and kind of intergenerational dynamic is actually one of the key things that drew us and our practices together. So I will, each of us will kind of introduce ourselves in time, and then we'll kind of engage in a conversation, drawing our shared and distinct vantage points. We'll share a bit about our spatial and creative practices, weaving together and engaging local issues and conversation across time and space. Next slide, please. So before we kind of dive in, I wanted to briefly acknowledge the times that we're in. I know Karen alluded to this as well. You know, in the last year and even in the last few months, we've all kind of borne witness to the ongoing impacts of racism, colonialism, and other systems of oppression. In the Canadian context, this has included the recent quote unquote discoveries, right, of mass graves of Indigenous children at formal residential schools, something that has been known by Indigenous peoples for a long, long time. We've seen the recent violent attack and murder of a Muslim family in London, Ontario, increased instances of hate crimes and harassment against those of Asian descent, a violent attack on a member of the 2S LGBTQIA+ community within a historically queer space in the city of Toronto, instances of Indigenous and Black women filming their final hours in Canadian hospitals while staff ignore, dismiss, and make light of their experiences, enhanced surveillance of groups like BLM and Indigenous-led blockades, and very recently, the forced removal of unhoused peoples from encampments in Toronto city parks. Next slide, please. So this is all happening, of course, against a backdrop of a global pandemic, you know, global ecological crisis, ongoing settler colonial violence around the world, and a global reckoning on racial injustice. And these acute and everyday instances of systemic violence are not occurring in a vacuum. They are a product of interrelated systems of oppression that continue to be upheld globally through our organizations and institutions. And while we should not flatten or make simple comparisons across contexts, having a greater understanding of how our local everyday acts of city building or activism fit into broader dynamics can provide really key insights to those of us engaged in city building and who are concerned with spatial justice. Next slide. So kind of speaking across the Canadian and South African kind of context, there is in fact a long history of places like Canada and South Africa trading practices on how best to undermine Black, African, and Indigenous life ways around the world and delegitimizing traditional and Indigenous ways of city building. You know, this includes everything from residential school systems, past systems that curtailed mobility and gatherings, and massive land expropriation and displacement via the development of reserves and homelands. Next slide. So given this legacy of systematized displacement and dispossession, and again, not with the intent to flatten or make direct comparisons, it is of course horrific, but also unsurprising and predictable that we see housing crises in places like Ottawa, Pascat, or vast townships in cities across South Africa. Next slide. Both countries also reflect a legacy and a lethal combination of settler colonialism and enslavement that reverberates to the present day. So we know that the enslavement of Black peoples existed in Canada for centuries, and their exploitation was used to build Canadian cities and economies. Even post-emancipation, historically Black towns like Africville were systematically denied basic infrastructure and subject to atrocious levels of environmental racism. And today we see Black peoples in Canada facing exponentially higher forms of institutional violence across all spheres of life. Next slide. So additionally, Canada is also a world leader in extraction, including a major player on the African continent. And this is a process that continues to displace and dispossess Black and African peoples from their lands and lifeways, and works to kind of create crises of migration around the world. The significance of the urban comes through here. So the city of Toronto, where many of you might be joining from, has the most mining headquarters of any city in the world. So the seemingly benign yet normalized violence of the city skyline again invites a different kind of conversation, one that transcends rigid spatial and temporal boundaries. This is not important just for identifying points of convergence, converging points of struggle, but also in elevating and fostering practices of reclamation, healing, and autonomy in the city. And so with that, to the next slide, please. I will pass it off to my colleagues to take us through their work and their practice. And yeah, I hope you enjoy the conversation. And I'll pass it over to Sibonelo.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Lena, and thanks, Karen, and all the organizers for this amazing conversation. So my name is Sibonelo, and I'm an urbanist and researcher currently based in Cape Town with my two colleagues who I'm presenting with today. And I'm from a city called Durban, which is two hour away from Cape Town on air. And I am, so I'm interested in the intersection of place and public culture. And I'll do some work also like on heritage contestations. And I'm just like interested blankly on Black futurities in urban environments. So I'll be speaking on a current project that I've been involved in, which is looking at the contestation that is currently taking place in my home city in Durban, in a suburb that I was living in before I came here, and it's called the Brea area. And what I wish to make visible is that not all community organizing comes from a well-meaning place, and some community organizing can result in like deepening some scars, which are still visible to some people, and they find ways to exacerbate like the fragments of the city. So in these two images that you see on the screen, so I revisit an experience that I had. Not now, and now I have hair. So before COVID-19, I had a bald hair, as you can see me on the left of the screen. So I was cutting my hair at a hostel. It's a hostel. It's called Dalton, and a hostel is a residential unit which most men in South Africa live in. So these units were built during a time when South Africa was solidifying, needing to have the labor closer to work environment. So you find that predominantly these spaces where men used to live in these spaces. Okay, so can you please pause? So yeah, so as I said, that hostels were initially introduced near the mines and then became a prototype of accommodation for Black workers, generally in cities in different design and different scales. Can you please also continue, Tareq? So I took this particular image in one of the visits and posted it on Instagram for a friend who's a visual artist, Sibonelo Gumede, to turn into a painting. So the title of the piece is Therapy, Politiki, which basically translates to therapy and politics. So we had a brief discussion about the piece, and he shared that when he saw the initial image, he imagined the process of going to cut his hair and how that becomes a therapeutic undertaking. He also shared that the barber shop to him is a symbol of a healthy dose of politics of the everyday, as relationships get built and maintained through a low threshold basis of the act of cutting hair. So although I personally did not have the advanced interior experience with my barber that Sibonelo had described, I had managed to negotiate being in this space and could feed my curiosities of observing the mundane everyday frictions and contestations that are in play. So frictions that shape Dalton as a space and also become a portal to understanding similar spaces in South Africa, which were conceived through the logics of racial capital. So Tareq, can you please pass? Yeah, so I took this image, which you can see on the screen in 2020. And so it reminds one of many encountered unsettling observations in this space of this bench. Yeah, and in its retrofitted state, the bench still had signage of Durban Corporation, a company linked to the apartheid government who organized bulk of Durban's industrial zones. So the signage read with instructions for the native people, one about how they should keep their money, and another on how they should attend to their health. So these instructions were written in Zulu, which is an indigenous native language to KwaZulu-Natal, where I come from. So encountering the depth of this bench and thinking about those that have sat on it before and those that continue to sit on it in the present really triggered Christina Sharp's thinking around the fact that there's no past and that the past is here with us. And in these words, Christina Sharp extends to say that history cannot be thought about as a paradoxical stance, but one that is here with us and organizes in multitude. So can you please pass, Tareq? So in a South African context, the fact that the signage was placed on the bench was symbolic and was consistent to how public infrastructures were organized and segmented during the apartheid era. So there was European-only benches, as you can see on this image by Peter Makubane, as well as non-European benches. So the previous bench was for non-Europeans. So this also applied to buses, public beaches, and other public infrastructures that were divided across racial lines. So the making of South Africa, particularly for Black people, cannot be told outside of the Western imperialism that was fueled by racial capitalism and manufactured the image of Blackness as both a resource and a denizen in the extractive sites that Black people traverse till this day. So the ideology would influence the stark geographical shifts of the 20th century, especially of the Land Act. Lena had showed the image of the making of the Land Act in the previous slides. And so can you please pass, Tareq? So in this book, Land Matters, Thembeka and Ngcukaitopi reflect on the colonial encounter as one which is consistent with the logic of conquest. So they connect this ration of conquest with the genealogy of secular colonialism, white supremacy, and ideas of enlightenment that have played out in a global context, especially in geography such as New Zealand, Canada, and Australia. So South Africa, frequently thought of as a country in transition, is emerging from an early post-apartheid era where the state promoted racial cohesiveness and a national reconciliation, generally referred to as Remboism, when the country became a democratic country in 1994. Sorry, can you please pass? So this doctrine of reconciliation has clashed with the calls of decolonization from South Africa's youth in the recent years. For example, movements like Rose Must Fall from the University of Cape Town have centered their activism around the episteme violence embedded in South Africa's uncontested symbolic colonial heritage. So this is an image by Sembile Msezane in 2016, when there was a Rose Must Fall protest in University of Cape Town. And this protest resulted in the removal of the Statue of Rhodes, which you can see just behind Sembile Some of the analysts also argue that the emergence of the movement like Rose Must Fall demonstrate that South Africa can no longer be thought of as a country in transition, but instead settle into the era of post-apartheid. And younger scholars are approaching this topic with wider urgency, reflecting about how South Africa is precipitating a new apartheid through neoliberalism. So the neo-colonial South African city as a site of production for new and transforming urban narrative, find means of reconstituting its publics. For example, the use of the bench at the Dalton Hostel, but also still exists within the multiple enclosures that the city has been built upon. So here, what you see on the screen, it's an image of Victorian and Edwardian styles of building, which kindly make bulk of the Bria area where Dalton also resides. So under apartheid segregation law, the Bria was declared a wide residential area, and the legacies of this are evident in how the space functions in the social imaginary. So can you please pass it? So in the present day, Durban CBD and its adjacent suburb of the Bria have experienced substantial white flight and a steady increase in racialized as Black, African, and Indian residents from the 1990s onwards, resulting in a diverse inner city demographic in the present. These demographic changes mark a significant shift away from the predominantly white urban center during apartheid. These shifts, however, have influenced tension and intolerance, and have also seen a huge wide flight of like white people moving in where they used to live to gated communities, which now make about 15% of the residential market in only 30 years. So so in places such as the Bria and other sites in South Africa, where some white people are still present, there are formations of civic association groups, which are aimed at safeguarding the status quo of these places. An example of these civic groups is one it's called Save Our Bria, a residential organization that has been active in Durban since 2003. The group's Facebook page describes the organization, Save Our Bria, was created by a group of activists who have come together to form Save Our Bria Working Committee, specifically to protest against eThekwini's lack of bylaw enforcement and serial neglect of our once beautiful Bria. We hope to make a positive difference by agitating and lobbying for improvement and change, specifically by turning around the broken window syndrome blighted our suburb. We say no to illegal building and businesses operating out of residences in our suburbs. We say no to crime, vagrancy, self-appointed car guards, and begging at traffic lights. We say no to defecating on the street. We say no to corrupt building inspectors. We encourage ratepayers to share their unresolved land use issues on our Facebook page. Tell us about absent landlords, slum landlords, illegal businesses, abandoned houses, illegal building and alterations without approved plans, as well as illegal destruction of trees in our areas. Put our stories on our Facebook page. If nobody else is listening to you, we will. This is your Bria, your investment in our city, your future. We say it's time to take back our streets, our suburbs, our lives. We say now is the time to save our Bria. So yeah, so that's what currently sits on the Facebook page of the group. So Save Our Bria page serves as a primary communal space for the group. So that's where most of these conversations takes place. As you can see on the screen, these are some of the comments. So on the page, notions of loss, nostalgia, and desire for a particular city futurity based on privilege and entitlement of whiteness collide. In this sense, the visual realm provides the platform for reimagining and recreating what perceived as loss in the physical world. Perhaps the need to protect the architectural spatial heritage of this era speaks to the broader set of anxieties about what Durban's and South Africa's future urban landscape might look like in the face of changing demographics and racial composition. Save Our Bria Facebook page has also become a space where racist and classist language and sentiments about architecture, heritage, and space go unaddressed. This is an antithetical to the claims made by the group of the idealist vision for the Bria as a suburb where different cultures could live side by side in a sought-after environment, and where, through good planning, people could live, work, and play near homes. The inflammatory, problematic comments reflected on the group's page, as in the example from the image that's on the screen, appears to have been ignored by the administrators, displaying a narrow and singular understanding of cultural heritage. The language used on the page, such as our and they, points to the claiming of the urban space and architectural heritage based on racialized underpinnings, as it implies a self and an other. Through this framing, the architecture of the Bria becomes racialized. Yeah, can you please pass some slide? Sorry. So this image is it's on a street called Curry Road, and this building, which is under construction, is one of the highly contested buildings around the Bria. So it went on trial for a couple of years, and part of it was that Save Our Bria didn't want for the private developer to build this residential building, which was part of the codes of the city to have more densification around this area. So what they wanted was that there needs to be a maintenance of the Victorian style buildings across this space, and much volume of people can live in around this area. So thinking about this, what had happened. So I think with Paul Guriel, when they speak about the weight of historical processes of racialization, meaning that we have to take the effects of such historical classification very seriously. The field of heritage conservation and its various encompassing disciplines is often positioned as a public good and a neutral undertaking. The ways that it is steeped in racism are largely ignored. So Stuart Hall in 2005's term, The Heritage, outlines the ways that the heritage of hegemonic groups came to be considered natural and not subject to questions. These were the key means through which it acquired power. So Stuart Hall writes that the heritage reflects the governing assumption of its time and context. It is always inflected by the power and authority of those who have colonized the past, whose version of history matter. Therefore, it becomes important to trace how settler colonial logics based on cultural archive of Western imperialism play out in heritage and preservation politics, at least in a South African context. The built environment as a tangible heritage is evident of the past and what is present. Therefore, it can be named, categorized, and controlled by those who have the power to do so. So we asked this broader question of whose heritage, and the answer to the question of whose heritage continues to be aligned with the settler colonial myth as the practice of architecture and the protection of legislation that serves it, restricts the expansion thereof to reflect current and changing demographics. These logics can shift and turn for what purpose it serves. And that could be linked to the gentrification also that is affecting cities that are so-called in the Western world. So I'll pass over to Tareq for the further presentation.
Okay, thank you, Sibonelo, and thank you, Howard and Karen, for inviting us. I thought I could start by sharing a little bit about my spatial practice in Palestine and then tie into some of my current experience in research in South Africa. So I'm a designer, architect, and design educator. I'm interested in the intersections of art, nature, and indigenous land practices, specifically in the forming of new spaces and circles for land-based pedagogy and learning, spaces for the sharing of indigenous knowledge and stories. I'm particularly interested in those practices that very intentionally, quote unquote, return to the land as a way to reclaim lost knowledge and provide alternative ways of being, especially in these times of increased urbanization. So I'm not going to dwell on too much detail, but I will highlight some aspects of this particular project. So this space was specifically set up on a hill next to the Palestinian village of Ain Kenya, a Palestinian agricultural village that sits across an Israeli settlement and military post. This land is traditional agricultural land, but is under direct military rule and is subjected to daily violence and restrictions. While working on this project, it was really important for it to be set up where it is, with kind of a stark reality of shrinking land. This piece represented our claim to space and tries to celebrate our presence. It's also a piece that drew inspiration from exploring distant epistemologies, drawing on medieval Islamic cosmologies, geometries, indigenous practices around pilgrimage to sacred grounds and processes of unification. And this was important because it helped us stretch our historical horizons to see beyond the often narrow colonial history we get caught up in. So in a context like Palestine, where politics can dominate the everyday, it's important not to fall in the trap of centering our artistic expression solely on the oppression we face, but rather affirm that our circumstances cannot fully define us. So stretching back the historical arc was really important for this project, as it locates the colonial encounter as a part of history and not the full thing. So this project really tries to peel back the layers of history, and in doing so, it unsettles the colonial narrative and this perceived permanence that it often impacts. This picture on the left holds a lot of symbolic meaning for me. This was the aftermath of a fire that happened on the hills of Jerusalem this past summer, which uncovered Palestinian agricultural terraces that were worked and maintained for centuries. The pine cover that you guys see on the right was intentionally planted after the occupation of Jerusalem in 1967 and was meant to cover the traces of Palestinian life and claim to the land after the communities were exiled. These terraces disrupt, in a very obvious way, the settler myth of the wilderness and empty lands. They instead show the incredible labor and centuries of indigenous land stewardship and speak to the ongoing Palestinian agricultural practices that are based on just and balanced land relations rather than extractive logics. The reason this image resonates a lot to me as well is because it speaks to the global ecological crisis, and it invites us to engage indigenous and pre-colonial worlds in a much more serious way, especially when it comes to the making of space and cities. So I think it's important to contend with colonial legacies that have shaped and still are shaping the way we experience cities today. Working and thinking across various settler colonial geographies, we had to trace back the complicated and triangular relationship between urbanization, coloniality, and the reshaping and remaking of land relations and agrarian transformations collectively. The colonial projects operated with a very different set of rationalities regarding to land when compared to indigenous and agrarian peoples. The rest of the non-European world was seen as simply a commercial enterprise. Notion of place and right land relations were brushed aside for racial capitalism and the violent remaking of landscapes and land relation. Extractive logics backed up by violence cultivated the plantations and plantation subjects all across the world. The genesis of the for-profit, export-based, monocultural landscapes were outlined at the hands of companies like the Dutch and British East India companies. Here, my colleagues and I really used Catherine McKittrick's work that insists that we must do a little bit of time travel to find the spatial origins that model and anticipate the logics that govern the present. Writing on plantations, prisons, and a Black sense of place across the Americas, McKittrick writes, the plantation as a meaningful geographic prototype that not only housed and normalized racial violence in the Americas, but also naturalized a plantation logic that anticipated the empirical decay and death of a very complex Black sense of place. Applying this approach to multiple geographies can help us make meaning of the world we inherited in hopes of making a better sense of our present moment. So going back to the example of Toronto, Lena mentioned a minute ago, when we start to trace the historical relationships across geographies, we start to see that the making of the settler city necessitates the reshaping of landscapes and land relations in multiple elsewheres. the kind of land transformations that are, for the most part, out of sight and out of mind for most urban residents. These land transformations encompass the subjugation of millions of natives who were forced away from their patterns of subsistence and livelihood to labor for the new masters, all to supply the demand and urban appetites in the capital cities. Knowing these histories can help us explain the long processes of capital accumulation that help build these cities, such as Brussels, and uncomfortably remind us that much of these extractive flows are still in place today. In this way, our innocent cup of coffee that we have every morning is implicated in these global agrarian transformations and long lineage of plantation and extractive logics. With these relationships in mind, we can start to conceptualize the city beyond its physical boundaries to include all the land transformation it necessitates, and locate the battlefield, the battleground of the city far from it on distant pastures and rural landscapes. So I want to try to tie this view of urbanization as the remaking of land relations to my experience living and thinking between Palestine and South Africa. As two settler colonial societies, that it's not surprising that there has been a natural solidarity between the two places. In the popular imagination in Palestine, as you can see the picture on the left, with the statue of Mandela, South Africa is seen as a success story, having been able to win political rights and deracialize its political system. What this view fails to understand is the deep-rooted legacies of centuries of colonialism and apartheid left behind. And while people have won political rights, their socioeconomic conditions, the socioeconomic conditions for the majority of people have been largely the same, and in some estimates worsening since the apartheid years. While the minority white population still owns the lion's share of the lucrative farmlands and property assets, while the majority of the Black population remains landless. So being in South Africa has really complicated this linear narrative for me, and suggests the one that suggests that one place is a few steps ahead of the other in this long journey to liberation, and has in a very sobering way reminded me that there are no quick fixes to this ongoing colonial encounter. Seeing these different manifestations of conquest across geographies affords us an added perspective and can help us broaden our understanding beyond local politics. For example, the land back movement that I've been learning about in Canada is deeply inspiring for the Palestinian context and can really help us stretch our imaginations. Experiencing and thinking across these two settler colonial geographies have helped me understand settler spatial logics and the key role settler economic interests have in producing and maintaining a cheap labor force. The process that produced the majority of landless South Africans is in process in Palestine today. Colonial land dispossession, inhumane policies that restrict and penalize indigenous land cultivation, transform the land from a source of livelihood into a burden. The flooding of the market with Israeli agricultural products produced, of course, on stolen lands further discourage the next generation from taking up the trade. The knowledge of the land, of caretaking of the land, is slowly lost, and the mostly young men start to look elsewhere at the settler city and settler economy for work. this is the genealogy of dependency and the making of a landless labor force that we're seeing in Palestine. And I think it's a process that is further ahead in South Africa. So from the slow death of the agrarian Palestinian economy to the entrenchment of wineries in South Africa, this is how we see the slow agrarian transformation take place. So on the left, you have the village of Batir, south of the West Bank. The land is traditionally stewarded by family farmers that maintain the land's productivity by planting and cultivating a variety of crops and trees around the seasons. This is not too far from how my family maintained our orchard growing up. On the right, you have the institutionalization of the plantation logic and the entrenchment of the for-profit, for-export, monocultural enterprise, only possible after the land has been pacified from agrarian stewardship. In the case of these vineyards in the Western Cape, they were maintained by slave labor that made the wines that would later be exported and consumed in European bars and pubs and homes. And so again, linking these geography and implicating these monocultural landscapes in the urban, they are urban. So the question I ask here is what is lost in this process and this transformation from stewardship to monocrop enterprise? And I'll leave that as an open question. Ruth Nyambura, a feminist environmentalist activist and organizer in Kenya, promotes the return to agrarian practices that she says have worked for millennia. Ruth ties our current ecological crisis directly to the commodification of land and social relations. Other farmers' movements on the continent, like the African Food Sovereignty Alliance, which is the largest civil society organization on the continent, with over 200 million subscribed members, are promoting agroecology and are pushing back at the industrialization of agriculture on the continent, and pushing back at the logics of agribusiness and the plantation logics. So I'll end with just an open invitation that perhaps we should continue to explore our distant past and draw inspiration from past societies who have organized and planned cities and human settlements far before the last few hundred years of the colonial era. This starts by acknowledging and unearthing the richness of pre-colonial habitations and practices that were meant to be erased by the colonial history. So some of our work with my colleagues here was to do exactly that, to tap into this really rich archive of specifically African architectures. On the left, you see a fairly large Zulu settlement near Durban. These settlements were quite large, estimates of 5,000 to 7,000 inhabitants. They were set up on slopes to have these very sophisticated systems of drainage. In the center, you have these communal spaces. And so with the advent of the colonial encounter, we see the imposition of social and even geometric reordering, which holds very different logics and rationalities, departing from the ideas of enclosure, communality, environmentally sensitive, and cosmologically orienting the Cartesian grid as you see here in the picture of early Cape Town, favors the logic of optimization, efficiency, standardization, and control. The historic disposition of Africans in South Africa context not only saw the brutal forced removal from the land, but a force of spatial and cosmological reordering, from the slopes to the flooded flats, from the circular enclosures to the sprawling grids, from a heritage of spatial technique passed on by the generations to an economy of makeshift architecture with cold materials. And so the study of ancient urbanisms is not meant to recreate the past, but rather derive principles that can help us plan better the cities of the future. In his book, Dean Sieta does exactly that, and he asks, what can America's first great immigrant city tell us about placemaking in support of social and spatial belonging? I'm just going to leave with a quote from an article Dean wrote. The ancients saw their cities as fully articulated forms that intimately connected natural features, celestial bodies, architecture, open spaces, people, material substances, cosmologies, histories, and memories, each with each element of the whole having particular affective qualities and powers. This vision is very different from the one informing settler colonial approaches to urban planning and architectural design. There is a rich body of empirical evidence from the ancient world documenting differences, exploring these differences, and strategies for enacting them would promote a strong linkage between the city of becoming and the city of belonging, as recommended by our best scholarly critics of the contemporary urban condition. And with that, I will hand the baton back to Lena.
All right, thanks, Tareq. And I am just mindful of time, so I may skip ahead to a few slides, but if you want to go to the next slide, Tareq. So as we've kind of seen throughout this, the processes of urbanization have consistently remade land relations both within and beyond the city, and produce distinct experiences of displacement and dispossession across time and space. And at the same time, dominant discourses center and advance particular and very limited understandings of urban development. So billions of us live in cities today. So it does invite a question around how to elevate suppressed practices and foster processes of reclamation, healing, and autonomy in the city. And so my time in South Africa has allowed me to bring different registers into conversation with each other and further refined an interest in reconstituting the archives and archival practices that are capable of capturing the nuances and richness of Black, African, and Indigenous urban lifeways across time and space, including those that have adapted and persisted across the pre- and post-colonial continuum. Next slide, please. And yeah, go to the next slide after this one. So we recently worked on a project on social housing in South Africa. And in doing so, we realized that a lot of the dominant kind of narratives and policies to draw on were very, very limited. Essentially, drawing on work like McKittrick and so on, realized that using the kind of limited colonial and enlightened imaginations kind of produced and anticipated the present day social housing house that is meant to inform and provide redress to the spatial and social and political legacies of apartheid. And so kind of in response to that, we chose to then engage with and expand the kind of archives through which we wanted to draw upon to rethink what would be most useful for us as spatial and creative practitioners. So next slide, please. So one such, so I'll briefly just go through some of the practices that we have found useful in kind of reconstituting the urban archive and ways that are more resonant and affirming of Black, African, and Indigenous life. So one is Indigenous African architectures. So African architects have argued that African architecture is overdue for a renaissance, not only for its bioclimatic adaptabilities, of which there are many and which is definitely critical in this time of ecological crisis, but also for the relearning of technique and cultural reclamation associated with it. Next slide. There's also a vast repository of initiatives engaging the concepts of Black futurities through a variety of methods and pedagogies. So one example here is Chimurenga. So please check them out. They are a publication of arts, culture, and politics from and about Africa and its diasporas. And the library project shown here works to really reimagine the library as a laboratory for extended curiosity, critical thinking, daydreaming, partying, and random perusal. Next slide. The next is the Sojourner Project, which is a mobile Black Studies Academy dedicated to initiating dialogues on Blackness and Black futurity in the 21st century. And it's structured as a mobile academy that intentionally aims to exceed the literal and figurative walls of the university, which is really resonant for us as folks that are engaged in the academy right now. And what's really useful about these initiatives and repositories is they make visible the spatiality and temporality of Blackness without the need to make it legible to the experiences, to the kind of white and colonial gaze. So it's really rooted in an embodied Black and African experiences. Next slide. And then there's, of course, the importance of elevating existing practices of placemaking. So on this slide here is a place called Sissy Ghoul House in the Woodstock neighborhood of Cape Town, a central area where there's no social housing. It is an abandoned hospital. In recent years, it has been occupied by displaced urban residents, very much along racial lines, and now holds 1,400 residents. So while technically it is an illegal occupation, its everyday practices around community engagement and food sovereignty are very notable. And next slide, please. This is a photo of a town of Kailicha, which is a township on the outskirts of Cape Town and is considered to be the largest and fastest growing in the whole country. So spatially and racially, it definitely reflects the legacies of apartheid. But within this space, there are powerful acts of sovereignty, such as this farm owned and operated by a Black woman. Next slide. And then here, we also engaged in creative practice as another very resonant method and pedagogy to engage when reconstituting the urban archive. And so creative practice in Black creative text is truly a very vast repository and archive. And a favorite of ours is Urban Village. So they're a group of musicians from Soweto, a township in Johannesburg. And as we've seen, centuries of colonial and apartheid practices in South Africa have created layers of displacement and dispossession, so much so that many might not even know their village or territory of origin, even in their own country. So this group explores the traditional roots hidden in and around the settlement's concrete buildings as a source of their music. And finally, we'll end with the last slide here. So lastly, just speaking a bit on significance of the kind of work that we're engaged in, transnational and intergenerational dialogue. So we're facing some very intense and seemingly intractable urban societal issues, and the importance of going back to pre-colonial ways of thinking that very much adhered to natural rhythms and systems, and the importance of unsettling the colonial narrative. And what these alternative epistemologies and urbanisms have to say about our contemporary acts of city building are truly profound. So with that, I know we are over time. And so if there are any questions or comments, or maybe I'll pass it back off to, our moderators.
Hello, hello. Oh my God, thank you so much for that. Wow, I've taken so many notes. I'm almost like, I don't even know where to start. There's so many different themes here to talk about. But thank you so much. Just to say, like, big props out. That was an amazing presentation. so many great thoughts, and really glad that you'll be able to spend some time with us to really get into some questions and Q&A. Just a note for the audience, if you do have any questions that you want to ask the panelists, please feel free to share it in the chat. Just type it in, or I believe you should be able to raise your hand. And if not, then please just type it in the chat and we'll try to get to your questions. Maybe what I'll do is I'll start kind of with the discussion, and then if any questions start to come up, we'll definitely find a way to get them into the conversation. I guess I really really loved a lot of the themes that you were talking about with regards to history and heritage and whose heritage. And a lot of times I like that whole piece actually that Sibonelo brought up about the houses in Durban and how people were complaining about how people weren't respecting a heritage or something like that. It made me think a lot about the almost the origins of the term heritage, which is actually about inheritance, right? And about this idea of something that's inherited from another generation. And in a way, what's happening though is that that inheritance kind of it's embedded inside of an enforced meaning, which a particular generation wants to enforce on another generation, right? By saying that this is heritage, or that we're going to pass this on with these meanings kind of attached to it. And so it kind of makes me think a lot about sort of some of the questions we have here in Toronto as we're dealing with a lot of these things as well. As a city, we often have these long debates about heritage and what actually constitutes heritage, and how do you actually, where do these pieces start to intersect? But I guess I wanted to hear a little bit more actually about how that interpretation is actually happening on the ground in places like South Africa and in Palestine. How does that conversation, how does that debate actually go? Just reflect on that for our audience.
So you want to kick off, Tareq, or I'll go first? Okay, so I'll go.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, yeah. So Howard, these conversations, at least in a South African context, are not happening as much in spatial terms. But with the image that I showed of A Rose Must Fall, so there's been broader, like a call for decolonization, mainly on the episteme at a university level, and also just challenging the relics that we see as monuments in the city, as we traverse the space. So there's been a growing question, at least in the last decade, of what does these imaginaries mean in the present? What are they upholding? What are they serving now? And just the meaning of them, and just also the labor and emphasis of maintaining them for them to be what they are. What does it serve? So there's been those broader calls. For it. But it's interesting how with Lena's slide on Urban Village, that brought in artistic practice, these conversations are happening, and they're happening in a way of reclaiming that these are our lands. And there's many ways that people negotiate that, and we see it through emergences again of spirituality, which was also suppressed in these lands. So you're finding there's a stronger embracing of people coming to themselves, but it hasn't played off as much in spatial terms. And it's worth maybe even mentioning that South Africa has 11 officially recognized tribes, and there are more. And with those tribes, there's a strong history of migrant labor because of the histories of this country of mining. And also there's been a strong exodus of migrants in the post-apartheid era. So you find that there's an area of ethnicities that exist and transverse these spaces. So it becomes such a limited imagery to uphold one heritage of enlightenment, which came through coloniality. So in this paper that one has written, it's challenging that. How do we define this question of heritage? Who is it for? And how do we try to rethink the futurities of how we can inhabit the space, all with everyone feeling at home and welcome.
Yeah, that's so resonant. Go ahead, Tareq.
Yeah, I'll just add my 2 cents on the conversation back home. I think there are multiple conversations happening, depends on where you look. So given kind of the geographies back home, you have certain certain Palestinians who are living in closer proximities with Israelis. So I think that conversation is very different from, for example, where I'm at in the West Bank, where there is hard lines and hard separations. But I think overall, the question of heritage in our context revolves around cultural appropriation of heritage. And so a lot of the old structures and buildings in Israel proper have been taken over by new inhabitants, whether they turn them into homes or places of business or art galleries. So there was a big kind of controversy around an art space in Israel that took an old Palestinian village that was exiled and turned it into this art gallery. And so there's an appropriation of space. There's also an appropriation of food. I'm sure you heard of the hummus debate and the falafel debate and all those sorts of things where suddenly they become branded as Israeli produce. And even recently now, our traditional dance, dabke, have been also claimed. So yeah, it's definitely a broad topic, and there's multiple kind of contestations happening. Yeah.
Great, thank you for sharing. Just seeing some questions now popping up in the chat. There's a question here from Nita who asks, this is for all the speakers, with the Toronto perspective in mind, do you think people who are working locally or somewhere missing out due to COVID guidelines and restrictions? Oh, I'm not sure what the context actually of that is. Maybe Nita, if you could elaborate a little bit more on your question there.
Maybe it's the way of bringing how the COVID issue may be impacting them in South Africa as a bit of a cross reference.
Yeah, maybe.
We know it's impacting life in Toronto. So how is it impacting life, and maybe even the perspective of how they're thinking about their research? That's this idea of pandemics, because we're hearing pandemics won't go away. They may keep emerging in different forms. So is this, and it may link back to the environmental aspect. I'm not sure, but maybe something to comment on. And then I think we should probably shift to get the folks from the Yes in My Backyard community to kind of dive in and share some of what's happening with them.
Yeah. And perhaps maybe also the impact of COVID and pandemics on organizing and being able to have these conversations. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot there. I think Karen named some of it in terms of obviously pandemics are linked to kind of like ecological like crisis and ecological like environment, like climate change and so on. One thing that's been interesting being here as a Canadian and seeing just the dialogue that's happening around access to vaccines and the rate at which people were able to get vaccinated in certain parts of the world versus others means that in places like South Africa, there's kind of an acceptance that we will need to learn how to live with this in ways that are different and manage living with a pandemic for much longer at different and higher rates, just because there is the same access to vaccines. And South Africa being a place on the continent that has essentially like the highest, a higher level of access to vaccines as opposed to countries in the West. Yeah, so maybe, and maybe if someone else wants to speak around organizing.
Tareq or Sibonelo?
So in relation to COVID-19, yeah. So maybe a quick one that I could share is that it's been so detrimental to employment, which was already tanking. So in a South African context, you're looking at a huge, it's close to 30-something youth unemployment, 30-something% youth unemployment. And I think that's what could be measured. That goes deeper within. So it has really exacerbated the inequality, at least in a Cape Town context. This is where we see that there's been an insurgence of even informal settlements, of people trying to find ways of accommodation. And maybe even in the slide that Lena showed, like occupations are, I think, in Cape Town, because people can't afford to house themselves, given in these markets, it's so expensive. So yeah, but interestingly also, the actual act of a state of emergency act, which is qualified by the pandemic, was able to shield people from demolition of their temporary structures. So that's where we also saw like strong visibility of homeless people in the city, of which, if it wasn't for the COVID regulations as per gazetted policy, they would be moved away. So that has really presented like different politics of ideas of home in the city, where in these suburban areas, the issue of homelessness is really presented starkly, and like you're seeing like homeless people living amongst other people. And yeah, so it's raising a lot of questions.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, definitely. I think COVID has impacted a lot of organizing and even the ability to have these conversations, I think, because I mean, government subsidies and hiatuses on certain policies do like mask a lot of that, but at the same time, I mean, they are also being exacerbated as well, like on the ground, and we all know it. So there's there's going to be like, I think, a very huge reckoning conversation that's actually about to happen all across the world once these policies and subsidies start to subside. And yeah. It's gonna be I don't know how I want us to be able to have a good progressive conversation about it, and my concern is that it will just be another issue of the powers and the structures that are in place kind of shutting that down, similar to how the homeless folks in Toronto were evicted from parks over the last few months. So that's my fear. Yeah, so I'm gonna maybe hand it back to Karen, perhaps, to maybe just wrap up, and just wanted to thank all of our panelists, all of our speakers, all of our presenters today. You guys are amazing. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much for sharing these beautiful perspectives, and also the wonderful work that you're doing to make Toronto a better place. So back over to you, Karen.
Thanks, Howard. Thank you for doing such a great job. It's always nice when you call a friend and colleague to moderate something that you know is going to be like a big thing with a lot of voices and content, and to be able to juggle between, as you said, the chat as well as people's comments is amazing. The panel, I mean, I don't know where to begin. I feel like there could be a commentary on each individual presentation. It was amazing to meet the three of you. I feel like, although I sort of knew Lena and then Tareq and Sibonelo, it feels like that when Lena had suggested this be like a triad, I could see that you actually are working together, that there's a synchronicity between the research that you're doing. And it was amazing. And to then see that link locally, that people, because you're never sure people are going to be interested in the international aspect, but I feel like Toronto for me is this international city. So many of us come from somewhere else or are connected to folks from away and are sometimes constantly pulling those threads. So to look at YIMBY in 2021, because technology allows us access to these international voices, it seemed like it would have been a missed opportunity to not leverage that. So thank you all for your sharing your research so generously with us. And for those of you who participated locally, here's to how this is built in the future and what the future looks like. for this city, because we know that local conversations result in local impact and change for making the city better. And so as many of us who can roll our hands up and roll our sleeves up and get involved and become active is super important. Sitting and waiting for someone else to do it, as we know, doesn't really result in the change we want. Margie Zeidler, thank you very much for the opportunity to do this work. You and your sister Christina are rock stars. Christina, as some of you may know, is a founder of YIMBY from 2006. Urbanspace Gallery team, thank you so much. Again, Yes in My Backyard, past participants that are still doing amazing work in community, thank you. We're looking forward to using this EyeCity concept as a way to continue to connect with people globally. So thank you for that. And I'm not sure we formally have your brand, but Josh and the team at Urban Strategies for helping with the promotion and for employing brilliant people like Jamila. Thank you. I think that's it for me. Do I have to say anything else? I don't think so.
Thank you so much. And hope to see everyone in person at some point soon. Yeah, thank you so much. Have a good day. Have a fantastic Saturday. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.